From FingerLakes1.com, this is the Debrief podcast. Welcome back. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. We have got a great show for you today. Plenty of interesting topics to go through, go over, talk about. But obviously, for those of you who've been following along with the program for a while, I'm clearly not normally sitting over here with two hands free. Normally, I am across the room behind the production computer. Now we have Paul Russo, who's joined the team recently, in studio with us. Now he's leading all of our production stuff and also handling a lot of our sports coverage as well. So a pre-thank you to Paul for what he's going to be doing for us here. Ted, we have made it through another week. It's been a couple weeks since we've talked, but a lot going on. A lot of confusion still about what to make of vaccine mandates, and our healthcare worker shortage. I'm curious if you just watched television news, Good Morning America, you and I have talked a lot about, or even just local television news, you'd probably think that there is a crisis that just began like a month ago when the state's vaccine mandate began. But it's interesting. It's clearly a crisis that's been brewing for months, if not years. And here we are a month in. Hospitals and healthcare facilities are really short-staffed, but it doesn't really seem to be because of this vaccine mandate that propped up out of nowhere. I want to talk about the coverage of it, obviously. What have your thoughts been so far on coverage of this so-called worker shortage and crisis?
Well, television news begins with a bias toward conflict and sensationalism. So I think we're seeing a little bit of that here. I think it's interesting. Way back in the early days of this pandemic, we talked about the social changes it would bring, and we're seeing that now. We're working differently, we're living differently, we're consuming differently, shopping differently, and so I mean, I think there are some shortages, but I think television news, protests make for good pictures. Yeah. So you go out, you point your camera, and people march around waving their signs and chanting their slogans. There's no doubt there's some shortage. I tried to book an appointment for a routine medical procedure recently for people of my age and was told, forget it, come back in a month. We're not even booking right now. They said because of a nurse shortage. So I'm sure there are some shortages. I don't know that it approaches the level of crisis. Everything on television is a crisis.
So the part of it that confuses me is, right, like we've heard a lot about Thompson Health, obviously part of the UR system. And it's interesting because the CEO of Thompson Health came out probably like a month and a half ago and said they already had a few hundred open positions and that they expected to lose, possibly 100 or 200 more, and there would be this scenario where they'd have 500 openings. And fascinatingly enough, it just never actually materialized, right? Like what we wound up seeing was a slight increase. So like Thompson said that they lost, a couple dozen employees because of the vaccine mandate. But outside of that, there wasn't any sizable loss. So I guess the part that's frustrating to me is like, clearly this has been an issue where somewhere in our healthcare system, we are not paying someone enough to actually be able to maintain or fill those positions, or there is a lack of training opportunities so that people can become these things. So what's the pipeline like to become a nurse? What's the pipeline like to become an x-ray technician? Or what's the pipeline like to become whatever it may be that there is clearly still a significant shortage of in virtually all healthcare environments? How do you fix that? Now, to me, that's totally absent of the pandemic. Like the pandemic has nothing to do with that. Maybe, some of the open positions were born out of, burnout from the folks who had to work, straight through the pandemic. I have plenty of friends, and my wife works in healthcare, and obviously, like, that's been very real. Like, I've seen that happen and play out in real life, but not to the tune of 300 open positions or 400 open positions, like not even close. So that's the part of it that has kind of been lackluster in the coverage, it seems like. And also a frustration that I think both of us share on this one is, the protests. You see a protest with 60 or 100 people participating in front of a hospital that employs thousands and connected to a healthcare system that employs several thousands or tens of thousands. and it's framed as this like major consequential thing. But if you have 60 to 100 out of 20,000 total employees frustrated enough that they're protesting a vaccine mandate, do you really have something that's that seismic? Do you really have something that's that significant happening?
Well, I think you touched on something early on. You mentioned that Thompson Health is now part of UR Medicine. I'm wondering how much the consolidations and mergers in the healthcare industry have had to do with this. If UR takes over Thompson and they both have a facility in a community, one of those is going to close and the other one's going to stay open, and I'm wondering how much is it that there are fewer facilities to go to because of this merger mania we're seeing in the business. I mean, there aren't very many operators left, and we've talked in the past about all the hospitals that don't deliver babies anymore. I mean, you can only go to a couple of different places for that. So I think that might be as big a factor as the vaccine mandates. But the vaccine mandate is conflict. And again, that's one of the ongoing themes in my morning show is that our media, especially television, thrives on this conflict. So they're always looking to puff it up, whether it's there or not.
Well, so if you take that a step further, I'm just thinking to myself, well, there's clearly conflict somewhere in this issue, right? And to me, I mean, you can sort of sift through some of these job boards and see what the openings at Thompson Health, at UR, with Rochester Regional Health, what they're paying, and they're incredibly not competitive anymore. They're starting people at $14 or $15 an hour. And you can go pretty much anywhere at this point and make more than $15 an hour. You can go work at the local fast food shop or whatever the case may be. You don't have to work in healthcare where the demand is clearly a lot greater, or the personal toll is clearly a lot greater now. So, I mean, I think that is probably where the conflict really is, and frankly, where the coverage should be focusing. I mean, especially with some of these bigger health systems where, the conflict that everybody loves right now is what are the people at the top making? And you can look at the filings in a lot of cases with these public or not-for-profit hospitals. So you can see just exactly how much, the CEO of Thompson Health is making, or the administrator at X hospital is making. And, that is a legitimate issue that probably needs more attention than it's gotten, at least in the last 2 months.
Well, I think you've touched on another bias of the media. I think the media tends to be pro-capitalist and pro-management over labor. We've been talking about this for months. Capitalists love free market capitalism until it turns around and bites them in the butt. We now have a shortage of workers. In a free market economy, when there's not enough of something, the price of it usually goes up. But the capitalists have steadfastly refused to raise these wages for the most part. They've blamed the federal supplemental unemployment insurance, which has now expired a couple of months ago. That's not a factor anymore. They've blamed lazy, no good people that don't want to work. They've done everything except look in the mirror and say, if we want to get workers, we gotta pay them more. But for the most part, a few places are, but a lot of them are just, they're refusing to step up, and until they pay that wage, they're not going to get people. And maybe at some future point, there'll be a glut of workers again, and then if that happens, you can lower wages. And then it's, that's how it's been for years and years and years. Workers pretty much had to take what they were given because they didn't have choices. Now they have choices. That's your capitalist system working in a different way, and either you like capitalism or you don't. You can't only like it when it works for you.
Well, and I don't know if and we'll ad-lib here and throw an extra topic in, but I don't know if you saw the unemployment numbers that came out yesterday from the state, but it was pretty incredible. It broke down the county by county look at unemployment rates, and most, if not all, counties in the Finger Lakes had a sub 4.5% unemployment rate, and at least 2 counties had an under 4% unemployment rate. And when you start going back, and I mean go back years, when you start looking at past years, not very often has unemployment been that low. People are working in the Finger Lakes and in upstate New York. I mean, there are a couple outliers. The Bronx had an exceptionally high unemployment rate, I believe somewhere around 14%, and that was like by far the highest. But when you're looking at communities around here, and I think like the rural counties between Rochester, Syracuse, and those in the southern tier, we've heard a lot, and we've heard from a lot of business advocates and people who own businesses, and even just, frankly, those who've been repeating the right-leaning talking points say it's because of the extra unemployment benefits are too high, people are lazy. It looks like you've maximized the current workforce. So it seems like a completely separate problem. You want to talk about misdirecting. To me, it seems like do we have enough people, work-aged people or people able to work in this region to support the economy that we have right now?
Here's the problem with the way we report unemployment. The unemployment rate is determined this way. People call people up and they say, do you have a job? If not, are you looking for one? If you're not looking for one, you don't count. I think there are a lot more people right now not looking for one, or as I've said before, maybe not looking for a second job that they used to hold. That's a fundamental shift that isn't being addressed at all. We started talking about this, last summer in the early days of the pandemic, the way things were changing. I just think a lot of people have decided they can get by on less and they don't need to work as much or a second or third job that they used to. So I think that's the rate is deceptive because the unemployment rate doesn't take into account people who no longer want to have a job. If you're not looking for a job, you don't count as being unemployed. They used to call that a discouraged worker. Today, I think we have to call it a I don't need this anymore worker.
Yeah, and that goes back to one of the fundamental issues that I've seen with you want to talk about the Finger Lakes. We'll use the Finger Lakes as an example. A tourism-centric economy thrives on a lot of part-time jobs. And all of a sudden, this pandemic has sort of reversed course where, people don't need those second or third jobs anymore. And maybe it's at least partly due to the fact that wages are overall increasing especially in a lot of like entry-level areas of work. Maybe if you're making $18 or $19 an hour now in a job that previously only paid like 11 or 12, maybe right. Now you really don't need that second job. Maybe the math just works. I
think that's exactly what's happening. I think you just hit it. That's a lot of it. I think so. So it's we need to take a different look. The unemployment rate may not be a meaningful number anymore, because I remember whether it was statewide or nationally a month or so ago, might have been the national numbers, but the unemployment rate was down, but so was the number of people working. I mean, I saw a figure somewhere in August, 3% of Americans quit their jobs.
Yep.
That's millions of people that said they don't need it anymore. And I think you might have just hit on a reason why. If people, if McDonald's is paying $15 an hour now instead of 11, then maybe you don't need that second overnight shift at the convenience store anymore. So now the convenience store can't find overnight workers.
Well, and what hasn't gotten nearly as much talk time is obviously in the national news you hear a lot about the Great Resignation that's been happening, and it's a lot of I'll say under 40 of the workforce, but for trained / experienced necessary jobs, it's just as competitive, and right now workers are jumping ship any chance they get for the better opportunity. And I think that is another point that probably needs to be made here is like, looking forward, maybe there are going to be some pretty significant gaps in our economy in terms of who has a glut of workers and who lacks workers. And I think probably there's going to be a bit of, at least for the next 6 to 12 months, a little bit of recalibration happening, probably, right?
Well, one of the things that happened during the pandemic is a lot of people got to work at home, especially in the early days, and they discovered something amazing. They loved it. You do your work when you want. I mean, unless you're in, a job where you have to be. I mean, I have to be at the radio station to do my morning show, but what I do the rest of the day, I can do it from home.
Yep.
I can do it remotely. And then what happened was a lot of workers, I read an article a while back where a lot of workers started relocating away from their company's main offices on the promise of being able to work remotely. And then when the pandemic started to wane last summer, I think it was, when the numbers started going down, a lot of workers decided, we want you back in the office. So that has now led to workers looking for employers that will be lenient with them in terms of things like remote work. So it's not just the wage you offer, but for example, if working remotely is an option in your business, will you offer that option to your employees? I just found it very liberating. I did it for a while, my administrative, day-to-day work off the air.
Yep.
I could go home at 9 o'clock when the show ended, and if I wanted to work from 9 to noon and knock it all out right now, I could. Yep. If I wanted to take a walk for 2 hours and enjoy the sunshine, then come back and do it, I could do that. And so a lot of workers are looking for that flexibility, and they were promised it, but then the promise was taken away. When things got better again, well, now we want you back at the office, and people are saying, well, I just bought a house 85 miles away from the office because you told me I could work at home.
Yeah. Well, and let me just say, I know we're not going to get into that today, but those employers are screwed. I'll just put it bluntly. They are going to face a reckoning over the next 2 years. That the paradigm is shifting. Forget about the power that workers have. It just isn't as efficient to work at an office, to commute to an office, to work inside of a space with middle managers and everything else. It's more efficient, it's better, and it's frankly a topic that deserves its own space. Because I think, when you fast forward 5 or 10 years, 75 to 80% of jobs are going to be performed remotely just because of the presence of computers.
If management is just going to have to get over the old-fashioned bias towards butts and seats. I mean, a lot of managers can't handle the idea of their employees not being where they can see them. I look over, there's Bob at his desk, he's pushing paper around, good, he's doing what I need him to do. Now Bob's gone, and we can only hope he's doing his work. What we're finding is people were. And a lot of people said, I'm more productive, I get more done in less time, which is another kind of old-fashioned economy bias, is this idea of 40 hours. Well, what if I'm really good at what I do and I can do it all in 25? Should I be punished and forced to work 40 just because everybody else does? A lot of workers are saying, if I get done what I'm supposed to get done, it shouldn't matter to you when or how I do it.
Yep. Yeah. So let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about the Geneva Central School District. Now, we are not going to get into the meat and potatoes of the issues in the Geneva Central School District, but generally speaking, what we've got going on here is this. Superintendent Patricia Garcia was placed on administrative leave after the teachers union there came out opposed to whatever thing is bubbling beneath the surface, which is why we're going to be talking about this. I believe we talked about a similar situation a few weeks ago in another school district, and if, believe it or not, in the spring we had another school district that we were talking about the same thing. The question that I have, and I feel like I already know your answer, but I want to talk about it again. Are we going to get answers in this? It seems to me at this point that Superintendent Garcia is not going to remain in Geneva. It seems like when someone goes on administrative leave, when an administrator goes on administrative leave for an extended period of time, that seems to be when negotiations are happening behind the scenes for that person to exit. Obviously, it was a personnel issue of some kind that got the Geneva schools to this point. But I'm curious, do we feel any more confident? Because Geneva is, we talked about Moravia in the spring, and Moravia is a much more rural, much more harder to reach district and community. Geneva, a few more eyes on the city school district. You got a newspaper right in town. You guys are based out of Geneva. It seems like conditions would be ripe for maybe learning or having some idea down the road what actually happened here in the name of transparency.
Well, I've said it before, the bias of institutions, including governments, is toward secrecy. It's just their default position. So will we learn more? Only if you and us and all the other media put the heat on, because otherwise they will try not to give out much information. And I understand there are certain situations where things are sensitive, but I just think in the long run, the more we know, the more we can have confidence that it's being dealt with correctly. That's right. If we know, here are the issues, this is what the teachers say the superintendent has done that they don't like, then we can evaluate and we can say, boy, they're right, she wasn't a good choice for superintendent, or we can say, no, they're wrong, they're being petty, this isn't an issue here. But when all you have is rumors and speculation, you really don't know.
Yeah, so I can get behind while you have, whether it's a contract dispute or whether you have like some kind of actual legal process playing out behind the scenes, or even if it's just like an administrative process between the school board, the administrator and their reps and whatnot, I can understand not wanting to talk about it then. Maybe there is a way you can communicate it without divulging too much or getting one side or another in a tight spot. But afterward, when it's concluded, it seems like you must come forward with the information on what happened, because quite literally every single thing inside of a school district especially is funded by taxpayers. It's not like there's any like gaps where there's institutional money or funds being used to make these things happen. Inevitably, like we've seen in a million other school districts, a deal will be struck and X number of dollars, whether that becomes public information because of a FOIL request that's fulfilled eventually, or whether that's just information that's handed out, inevitably money will exchange. And people probably won't know why or how or what got us there, and there will be confidentiality clauses and everything else, as we learned through the Moravia situation. And to me, that is just a scenario where no school district should even be able to, a school district shouldn't even be able to get there. Like, that should not be an avenue that can be taken at all. Whether it be the state that needs to step in and create some sort of real regulation around that and around how these processes are handled, or whether that means, individual districts just do the right thing and start sharing that information once things are fully concluded on the legal side. One of the two has to happen, because it does, like you've said a million times, it erodes public trust in all of those institutions, and school boards especially. We're going to be talking about politics and how it's gotten a little tacky here in Seneca Falls. School boards have gotten as tumultuous as any political body in American politics over the last 6 months, and it had a lot to do with the pandemic, but situations like this certainly aren't going to help the cause.
And even beyond the secrecy issue, if the superintendent has done something wrong, then why are we, the taxpayers, paying her money? If I do wrong in my job, I'm either chastised or rebuked or let go. I'm not given money. Nobody says, well, Ted Baker dropped an F-bomb this morning, so we're giving him $80,000 to go away. If it makes you wonder about the veracity of the charges. If we're saying, like in the case in Moravia, if we're saying that this person did something wrong, then why are we paying them? Why are we not terminating them immediately if it's a terminating worthy offense? Mm-hmm. If it's not, take whatever charges are appropriate. But I think you said it very well, which is when it's all concluded, at that point, there's really no one who needs protection anymore. If we're paying this administrator to go away, then I think we who are paying her deserve to know why.
Well, and one of the things you just said like sparked that thought too in my mind, which is obviously there's a flaw in the contracts that administrators are getting in these situations, because what are these payouts a result of? They're not a result of the actual wrongdoing or rectifying the wrongdoing. It's an answer to the contract that was signed originally, which clearly allowed for this kind of exit to happen. And in that scenario, I just think that, again, if there's a flaw in how contracts are handed out to administrators in schools or in politics or whatever the case may be, public whatever, that needs to be corrected too. And that may be the place to, frankly, maybe that's the place to start, so that avenue isn't available to school boards or any governing body.
That's a very good point. And then also, when you do sign a contract, it needs to be enforced. There was a case early on in my time in the Finger Lakes. A superintendent was hired by a local district. One of the contract clauses was that he would move to the district and become a resident. Well, he didn't. A couple of years went by, and they liked him, and they liked the job he was doing, so he just simply refused, and the school district agreed to look the other way, and he never did relocate to the district. And, of course, brings up the question, if you want to work in the school district, why isn't it good enough for your kids to go to school in, and why aren't you living here? So it's a combination of writing better contracts and then enforcing the ones that you have. But that's a very good point, why should a contract allow misconduct and then have that misconduct essentially be rewarded?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about another kind of tacky political angle here. We've got elections coming up, obviously. Those playing out in Seneca Falls seem to be getting the most attention here in the Finger Lakes because we don't have too many county races of a lot of interest happening. Sheriff's race up in Wayne County, but outside of that, not too much. Flyers, we've got flyers going out left and right here if you live in Seneca Falls about Seneca Meadows, the landfill, the election, the financial impact that this entity has had on the election or on the town's budget, depending on what your take is there. The part I wanted to talk about with you is this. What's worse, the financial impact that one large corporation can have on an election? We've learned, obviously, that Seneca Meadows' parent company has spent an exorbitant amount of money on this particular cycle, or the unshakable focus on a singular issue, like having a landfill in your community. So like, what's worse out of the two of those for the health of the community?
Well, I think they're both problems, and then I think there's a third issue. It's not just the impact a large corporation can have on an election, but a large impact that one single corporation can have on an entire town budget. Yep. My understanding is, I believe that the proposed Seneca Falls town budget is in the neighborhood of $13 million. Is that correct? And then my understanding is does Seneca Meadows provide approximately $3 million a year? Do I have the right figures?
It varies, but it's between 3 and 3.5.
So anyway, yep. Roughly not quite a quarter of the budget coming from one community. So that sets you up for a problem right there, because then who owns who?
Right.
Does Seneca Falls regulate Seneca Meadows, or does Seneca Meadows tell Seneca Falls what to do? And in interest of full disclosure, Seneca Meadows is an advertising client of the Finger Lakes Radio Group. However, in my entire 18 years there, I have never once been told what to say or not say on the air, credit to our management. So right. I feel like I can be open and honest about it. So the biggest question I have for the two counselors who have been the most vocally anti-landfill, who say, no problem, we'll balance the budget, how? How are you going to do that? Most budgets I've seen, anywhere in the neighborhood of roughly 70% of the budget is mandatory spending, contracts, obligations that you can't cut. Basically, what they're saying is that you can take the entire discretionary budget of the town of Seneca Falls and cut it out. I don't see how they're going to do that. And to my knowledge, and if they have released any details of their plan, I haven't heard it. Maybe they have, but to my knowledge, they have not said how they're going to do this.
So there have been proposals, and there have been sort of ideas floated at different meetings and things like that. And I think the town is trying to approach this with, or I should say the current town board is trying to approach this in a maybe we'll end up having to go this way, maybe we'll end up having to go that way kind of direction, because obviously personal opinion of those on the board varies. You've got 2 board members who are in theory for and 3 who are opposed. All that aside and done, the thing that I keep coming back to is this. It's like, yes, corporate money in politics is obviously bad. We've seen it at all levels. It's not the greatest because, for one, you don't always know where it's coming from. The LLC loophole that Jackie Augustine loved to talk about on the show over and over again is one example of how corporate money winds up finding its way into elections. The money that's being spent on this town race is probably an issue to a lot of people because of how much it is compared to normal town races. It just usually doesn't happen. My curiosity is, does it sway that many people? Because one of the issues, and this is why I think the singular issue, like the unshakable focus on a singular issue, is so much worse for a town like Seneca Falls, is that I'm pretty confident most people's minds are already made up. You know, I've seen a lot of people sharing their opinion and their view over the last 2 weeks on social media. Obviously, we've been running some letters to the editor and things like that. I don't think there is anybody whose mind was made up or changed in 2021 about the Seneca Meadows issue, because as long as I've been here at Finger Lakes 1 for 8 years now, and as long as I have been here, we've had 4 different town supervisors and many different town board makeups, and the Seneca Meadows landfill issue has been the number one undivided issue throughout that entire time, whether it be the odor, whether it be local laws to ban it in the future, or whatever the case may be. My other cautionary tale that I just feel like I need to bring up every time this topic comes up is this. Everybody is putting a lot of attention and a lot of focus on the local law that was passed to force Seneca Meadows to close by 2025. I would ask yourself this. Come 2025, forget what legally Seneca Meadows can or cannot do in terms of challenging the local law. Forget about what the town board can or can't do to enforce its regulation, as you pointed out. What's the state going to say about shutting down one of the state's largest landfills? Is that even going to be an option? Is the state even going to allow that to be an option? I think that's the bigger question here when it comes to landfill operation in Seneca Falls. And I haven't seen any, and I could be wrong about this is a little bit of speculation, but I haven't seen any town board member or even community activist, for that matter, really pushing this issue to the state and trying to get some assurance from the state that if the town does choose to move forward with a local law that forces Seneca Meadows to shut down in 2025, that the state backs them up on it. Because if the town is attempting to go against a mega corporation in 2025, the town probably doesn't have a very good chance. But if the state is with the town on that decision, then you possibly have inroads. But that is probably the bigger question that I have right now. What is the state going to say about it?
And if Seneca Meadows has a lot of money to put into the local campaign, imagine how much they have to put in the Hochul for Governor campaign, which points out another problem, which is the heavy-handedness of the state of New York. I've never lived in another state in my life where the state has so much sway. I mean, we're talking about, just to diverge here for a second, the renaming of Squaw Island on Canandaigua Lake. The city decided to rename it. They needed approval of the State Commission on Naming Small Islands in the Middle of Lakes, or whatever the heck it is, and the DEC. Yeah. I mean, where else does the state have to approve of a city renaming a piece of its own property, its own borders? So the state of New York is just so heavy-handed in every part of our lives that ought to be local decisions. So yeah, I don't. And the other question I have is you know, you work here in Seneca Falls, you might have a better input than I do, is how big an issue is this with the residents? Is this an issue that's big with residents, or is it an issue that's big with the political class and the residents really don't frankly give a damn? For example, the Cayuga Indian issue. I've said for years, I think the only people that care about that anymore are a handful of government officials in Seneca County. Everyone else has moved on. So is this, when people stand in line at the bank or at Wegmans, do they say, I can't believe Seneca Meadows wants to stay open, or is this just an issue for politicians running for office in campaigns?
So I think the answer to that is they probably care enough to have an opinion about whether they like having a landfill in their town or not. But does it move them to the point of engaging with a political system that they otherwise wouldn't engage with on the day-to-day? And the answer is no. That's my view of it. I don't live in Seneca Falls, obviously.
Here's why I asked this. It was interesting. On the drive over from Geneva, I stopped at the red light at 414, and to the right was the truck with the big sign on it, the future of Seneca Falls. And so I glanced out my window to my left, and I saw a grassy hill. And that was it. Yep. I'm a quarter of a mile away from Seneca Meadows. I can't even see it. Yep. How big an issue is it for somebody that lives 7 miles away? I mean, even if you live a mile away, and full disclosure, yeah, I could smell a little bit of smell. But seriously, I mean, you know, how big an issue can this be for someone who lives 10 miles away on the other side of town? What do you care other than that 25% of your town budget is taken care of by this one company, so I don't have to pay the taxes?
Well, so you could also follow that logic a little further and say, you know, had Seneca Meadows between, say, 2014 and 2016 mitigated odor better and handled odor better, would this have actually turned into the issue that it turned into? Because I think the odor is, if we're going to, cherry pick issues here, the odor is the one issue.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing in Ontario
bothersome.
County. It's been a big problem, and at certain times, I mean, when the wind blows in the right way, I can smell it from the radio station parking lot, which is maybe 4 or 5 miles away.
Yeah. This is just not, my big curiosity, especially with a town like Seneca Falls, if you're just following the flyers, if you're just following the local coverage in terms of how this has been, the landfill issue and this election has been covered, you would assume that turnout would be seismic. You would assume that a ton of people will turn out to vote next week in Seneca Falls. And I'm very curious to see if it aligns with the expectation. Because
that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. That's a big test. If
an off year.
If not many people show up, then it was really a lot of ado about almost nothing.
Yeah. But you did mention something I thought was interesting that lends right into this topic, or I should say our next two topics. Marijuana legalization and the state having a governing body for practically everything, or a board. We obviously know that there is going to be a marijuana regulation entity. I believe it's going to be called the Control Board, and they're going to create the rules that the licenses be issued based on so that people can go out and sell and manufacture and all that good stuff. We see some businesses going through the zoning and the administrative and the municipal process to get things going. I'm thinking of the facility, the Colorado company that's going to be opening a facility in Auburn, in the city of Auburn, in the industrial park. While I think of others around the state, we've heard of some stores selling T-shirts in Rochester or stickers down in Corning, and then gifting a small amount of marijuana as a I guess a thank you, or whatever the case may be. But they're effectively just selling marijuana. We saw the Corning Police Department come down really hard on the business in Corning that was doing that, but the business in Rochester that has been doing it for at least the last 6 months is doing it without any sort of reprise at all. It's interesting. Does the state need to really get moving on this? Because now at this point it seems like people are starting to get antsy about how they're going to move forward. And my other question is, if you have some businesses getting a head start in terms of developing a business with customers, aren't you disadvantaging the businesses that quote unquote go through the process and wait as long as it may take for the state to finally get it together and issue these damn licenses?
Yes, you are. And I didn't understand in the first place why these things should always take so long. I mean, how many different things does government license already? It shouldn't be hard to set up a licensing and permit office. We have driver's licenses. Barbers and beauticians have to get licenses. Truck drivers have to get CDLs. I mean, we already know how to regulate and license things. So get out the template, change driver's license to pot license, and get on with it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because it seems like this is something that the state is really looking for in terms of tax revenue. And it's almost as if they have this great idea, and this is like the implementation crisis, I think, that the state faces on a daily basis, is like they have this great idea, they think of this awesome thing, they do it, and then it takes 3 years for it to actually come together and come to fruition. And it's mind-boggling to me at this point that, I mean, I could see a scenario where some businesses, excluding, entities like the Cayuga Nation, who can just, because of their sovereign status, can just completely thumb their nose to any of the state or local regs and just move forward with whatever they choose to do. It seems like it'll end up being a real hurt where some businesses may end up having to wait like a year or 2 years before they're able to get moving. The interesting thing to me that I've seen develop is it seems like a lot of folks who own liquor stores and businesses like that are the ones that are most interested in exploring this other avenue for their businesses. And it's like they've already gone through like the state already, use a liquor store as an example. I want to know what the state doesn't know about a liquor store or its owners that they could possibly need more information going through this process. They're regulated out the wazoo as it is.
I think part of the problem is overcoming these decades of opposition to pot being legal in the first place. I think a lot of people still struggle to wrap their head around the idea of pot being legal, that you can walk into a store, grab some, go sit down in the park and light it up. I just don't think some people anyway, are ready for that yet. I think that's part of the delay. But, we talked about this in the early part of the pandemic with some of the guidance, and it's just the state's really good at saying, okay, we're going to do this, but when someone says, okay, how, we'll get back to you in 3 years. I mean, like you said, it's just, we know how to license and regulate things. Believe me, the state of New York, if there's anything they're really good at, it's that. So get on with it. Get the licenses. And then you have the whole local opt-out thing, which we're still going through, which I think, some communities are just missing the boat. So, okay, well, we're not going to allow any pot sales in our town. All right, great. Your residents will drive to the next town over, and you get no tax money, and they do.
Yeah. That's another issue that I think once we have I believe January 1st is the date
where
all of those
for opt-out.
Yeah, the deadline. Everything has to be settled by then. It'll be very interesting to see what that makeup looks like. How many, especially when you look at the rural Finger Lakes. How many communities are in, how many communities are out. Right now, it seems like, I think some people believe that the list is growing on the opt-out side, but it really isn't that large. It seems like there are like 2 to 3 towns in every county in the Finger Lakes that have said, nah, thanks, but no thanks.
Well, because I think a number have realized that it's just that there's no point. I mean, I talked to Supervisor Venuti from the town of Geneva, and he said, if we opt out, the city of Geneva is a mile away, and if they opt in, then what's the point? All we're doing is cutting off our revenue nose to spite our face.
Sports betting. There's another one that was pretty much adopted statewide at the same time, but we don't seem any closer to being able to move forward with that. Obviously, the governing bodies, I think, already exist there. Are we waiting for a big, shiny date like the Super Bowl, or are we just, maybe we're never going to see this?
I don't know, because again, look at horse racing. That's one of the most regulated things on the planet. So we know how to regulate gambling already. We know how to license it. I don't know what the delay is.
Well, the state
that'd
wants
be a great answer. That'd be a great question in a news conference for the governor. Is, hey, Governor Hochul, why is the state so slow to implement the nuts and bolts of these grand ideas? We have these grand ideas, and obviously taxing vice has always been, that's how alcohol's been for years and years and years. We say, don't drink and don't drive, but then we tax it to death, and the governments make money off it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, I think. The only unknown, right, at this point is when will the state decide on a vendor, right? Because that was what we had been waiting for before when Cuomo was in office. And it seems like maybe with some of these, and obviously the transition between former Governor Cuomo and current Governor Hochul, the transition was obviously rough. Like, there wasn't much of a relationship between the two of them. That's become clear. He wanted her out and off the ticket if he ran again. Obviously, there's a lot of catching up that she's trying to do while also campaigning to be governor for a full term. But I think, these are the things that are going to bite her come November next year when people go to the ballot box, if this is not sorted out, if these things are not sorted out, because it will feel like it's been much longer than it actually has been. There is an argument to be made to say, marijuana legalization and mobile sports betting were only just approved in the spring. To think that they should be up and running now maybe is a stretch, but come the middle of next year, that's going to be a pretty significant issue, I think.
Well, and it just seems like time after time we get the grand idea and then we don't get the nuts and bolts behind it. So if you're going to say, let's have legal pot sales or let's have electronic sports betting, then okay, start working on the details. That's not something you start doing 2 years later. That's something you start doing from day one. All right, let's set up the bureaucracy. Let's set up the licensing process. Let's set up, for that matter, why do we need one official vendor? Why can't anyone who runs such a service apply for a license, The
Amazing
way
question.
anybody can apply, there's not one state liquor store, which is funny actually, because that's where I grew up in New Hampshire. They actually have state liquor stores. I'm surprised New York hasn't come up with that idea yet of taking them all state-owned instead of private. But
don't put it in their head, Ted. Don't put it in their head.
Governor, don't do it.
So last topic, bonus topic for the day, this border fight that seems to rear its ugly head every, 4 or 5 years between Seneca County and the city of Geneva over that little slice of between the state park and the city of Geneva that is owned by the city, I guess, but technically in the county's jurisdiction, and creates this really bizarre scenario where everybody needs to agree and you've got multiple boards and zoning and this, that, and the other thing. Waste of time or worthwhile thing? Because what we saw a few weeks ago, for those who don't recall, we saw the Board of Supervisors essentially move in Seneca County, move forward with a resolution or a point to be made that it's theirs. Anything that happens there has to go through them, and the border between the two is apparently somewhere in the bottom of Seneca Lake, which to me is very confusing because...
Well, a few questions. I guess my first question is, if the land belongs to Seneca County, who sold it to the city of Geneva in the first place?
Great question.
If Seneca County sold it to them, then shut up and sit down. They own it. But the other question is, how can a city buy land in another place? Why? That doesn't make a lot of sense either. So I wasn't aware that this had flared up again until you sent me the notes. So I guess what's Seneca County's point behind all this? What do they care if it's their land or the city of Geneva? Is there something planned for there that's going to...
It seems as though they want the regulatory control. And that is pretty much where it ends. They simply, and I don't know if it's more of just making the motion for the sake of making the motion, that they are engaged in the process.
I mean, are there plans to develop this parcel? I know there are plans to expand the marina there at the state park. I don't know if this has anything to do with that.
So I guess the question would be, is it a concern about how far Geneva could potentially go in doing whatever they want to do with the entire lakefront area? Because it is, for all intents and purposes, theirs.
Well, I wouldn't worry about that. Geneva's been trying to figure out what it wants to do with the lakefront for about 1 million years now, and
it hasn't.
So therefore they haven't. My joke has always been they should open up a museum of lakefront studies.
Well, so to that end, there are I can think of a handful of spots. So you've got that one between Geneva and Seneca County where you've got Waterloo, Fayette, the county, Seneca County, and the city of Geneva all sort of playing in the same sandbox. You've got, in the village of Waterloo, the town of Fayette extends into the village, or right to the village, into the town, and it seems like there are these outdated borders that probably just need to be cleaned up a bit. Could we just clean up the borders and make them make sense?
Well,
why am I in Fayette when I'm driving through the village of Waterloo?
Honestly,
it makes no sense.
I've never understood. This is the only state I've lived in that has this whole village and town concept and everything overlapping. I mean, again, to go in my home state of New Hampshire, you are in a community, and when you go across the line, you're in the next community. There's no such. I mean, the city of Geneva is this island surrounded by the town of Geneva.
Yeah.
And what's the point and what's the difference? And why does someone who lives here in the town of Geneva pay no tax, and the person who lives 50 feet away in the city of Geneva, and both of them work in the same store downtown, pay different taxes? I don't understand that whole city, town, village concept to begin with, or why it originated. I don't know if there's any other state, honestly, that does it that way. You got me curious now. I'll have to do some research and see.
So you're saying dissolve them all?
Well, I'm just saying make everything,
make it make sense.
Everything should be, for example, there's really no reason to have a separate city and town of Geneva. It should all be what's now the town of Geneva, should be the city of Geneva. Sorry, Supervisor Fernuti, I just took you out of a job. But
well, it would at the very least clean up the regulatory side of it.
Right.
Anyway, we've come to the end of the show here. Ted, where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday? I'm
on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio in Geneva. That is 106.3 and 1240 WGVA. In Auburn, it's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys. We will be back next week. We'll see you then.